My name is Honor Burgess, and I am the daughter who never quite fit in at the Burgess family table. When people picture the Burgess legacy, they usually think of my sister Lydia, the golden child who can charm a room with a smile and whose every move seems to be applauded. Me? I'm the quiet one, the one who flies under the radar, the daughter who lives modestly and works tirelessly in a world where I'm often the only woman in the room. I am an aerospace engineer, a profession where precision and patience are everything. For 15 years, I've dedicated myself to pushing the boundaries of flight, not just in theory, but in practice. Designing, testing, problem-solving in a male-dominated industry where every project I touch demands excellence. I'm not the type to boast about my work. I let my results speak for themselves, even if that means being overlooked at family dinners or forgotten when the spotlight shines. Ethan, my husband, is my quiet anchor, an accountant with a steady job and a steady heart. He's the kind of partner who understands the late nights spent poring over blueprints and the frustration when a design doesn't work out. We live simply in a modest townhouse just outside the city. Our home isn't the grand estate my family prides itself on, but it's ours, a place built on mutual respect, hard work, and a shared vision of a life not dictated by appearances. Family calls come in waves, invitations to meetings, gatherings, the usual Burgess events that revolve less around connection and more around status and image. I accept these calls out of a sense of duty, even though I always sense the cold distance beneath the polite words. Lydia's voice is always sharp, her comments subtle but cutting. And my mother, Margaret, tends to side with her, dismissing anything I say or do as insignificant. At the last family meeting, I remember the sting of Lydia's laughter when she glanced at my car, a reliable but unflashy sedan I'd bought with my own savings after years of steady work. "She can't even buy a car that fits the family name," Lydia sneered, loud enough for others to hear. My mother sniffed in agreement, adding with a dismissive wave, "It's just junk." The room echoed with forced chuckles, but the knife of humiliation cut deep into me. I smiled through it, of course. It's what I always do. But inside, a seed of discomfort grew, twisting into a gnawing sense of invisibility. I replayed those words over and over after the meeting ended, feeling the weight of being the other daughter, the one who doesn't measure up by their standards of success. Despite it all, I hold on to the knowledge of my own value. My achievements in aerospace might not glitter in family gossip, but they are real. I build things that fly. I solve problems that keep people safe. I pour years of my life into something meaningful, even if the people who raised me choose to see only what's missing, not what's earned. This is my world, quiet, demanding, and often lonely, but it's mine. And as I sit here now, reflecting on that last family meeting, I know the story between Lydia, Mom, and me is far from over. The cold glances and whispered judgments aren't just pain, they're a challenge, and I'm ready to face it on my own terms, no matter how much they laugh or sneer. Growing up in the Burgess household wasn't just about family. It was a stage set for comparisons, where every act and word measured one daughter against the other. From as early as I can remember, Lydia was the star. She was the perfect daughter, glowing with an effortless charm that seemed to capture everyone's attention. Teachers praised her for her social grace. My parents beamed whenever she took the spotlight at school events or social gatherings. She was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. And I was just me, the awkward, overly serious, too practical daughter who never quite fit their ideal mold. Mother, especially, had a way of making that divide glaringly obvious. I remember one afternoon during my teenage years when I brought home a science project I'd labored over for weeks. It was a detailed model of a satellite, complete with moving parts powered by a tiny motor. I was proud, really proud, but when I showed it to Mother, her reaction was a kind of polite disinterest. She gave a quick glance, then said, "That's very practical, Honor, but don't you think you should focus on something more social? Lydia's organizing the charity gala next week, you know." Her tone was gentle but unmistakably dismissive, as if my hard work was merely a curiosity, not worthy of real celebration. Meanwhile, Lydia's achievements were held up like trophies. I recall the scholarship announcement vividly. Our father's trust had funded Lydia's college tuition with ease, a gift she accepted with a radiant smile, while I was quietly told to make do with less. No explanation, no shared opportunity. It was just understood that Lydia, with her effortless charisma, would carry the family name forward, while I was to settle into a more subdued role. School events, family holidays, and even casual dinners became arenas for this unequal treatment. Lydia's stories were heard first and laughed at loudest. Mother's eyes sparkled with pride when Lydia spoke, but when I tried to join in, offering a thoughtful comment or a dry joke, I was met with a polite nod or a quick change of subject. Over time, I learned to speak less, to blend into the background. The label of awkward and too practical stuck, not just from my mother or sister, but from the subtle, silent judgments of the whole family. It wasn't just emotional distance. It shaped my very sense of self. I began to question whether my ambitions were misplaced or my personality flawed. I remember nights lying awake, wondering why my practical dreams didn't seem to matter as much as Lydia's social successes, why my quiet nature was mistaken for coldness or lack of spirit. I was painfully aware that, to them, my value was measured not by what I created, but by how closely I resembled their expectations. Yet, somewhere beneath the surface of this favoritism and dismissal, I found a quiet resilience. I started to understand that their praise of Lydia was less about who Lydia was, and more about who they wanted her to be, the image of success they cherished. And me? I was not the image they wanted, so I remained invisible, dismissed as just practical, a trait they never admired but often mocked. Looking back, I see how this early favoritism planted the seeds of my later struggles, how it taught me to hide my worth behind humility, to accept exclusion as inevitable. I convinced myself family love was complicated, not simple or fair. I told myself patience was a virtue, that someday my efforts would be seen and valued. But deep down, the truth lingered unspoken. The family I was born into celebrated charm and appearances, while my steady, quiet competence was overlooked or undervalued. It wasn't just about love. It was about recognition, about being seen as more than a shadow beside my sister's spotlight. And that absence of recognition carved a space inside me that longed for justice, for dignity, even if I didn't yet know how to claim it. So, as I reflect on those childhood years, the contrast between Lydia's favored place and my sidelined existence is stark. It's a story of a family divided not by hatred, but by a silent hierarchy of worth that shaped every interaction and decision. Knowing this is essential, because it explains why, even now as an adult, the echoes of those early judgments still ring loud at every family meeting, and why I'm determined this time it will be different. Financing my education was never easy, and I did it mostly on my own. Unlike Lydia, who had the luxury of our father's trust fund backing her every step, I cobbled together scholarships, part-time jobs, and student loans, each payment a small battle I fought quietly. There were nights when I worked late shifts at the campus library, gripping a worn coffee cup in trembling hands, the exhaustion pressing down but never quite enough to drown out the stubborn drive fueling me. It was a solitary path, often overshadowed by my sister's social events and the family's celebrations of her success. But I was determined to carve out my own place, even if it meant doing so in the margins. When I finally graduated and settled into my career as an aerospace engineer, I thought my family might begin to see me differently. Instead, the invisible boundary between Lydia's world and mine remained as firm as ever. Yet I refused to let that boundary define me or my responsibilities. As our parents aged, the burden of care and maintenance fell squarely on my shoulders. I became the fixer, the one who repaired leaky faucets, replaced broken tiles, and managed the endless paperwork of bills and insurance. These tasks were invisible work, the kind that doesn't earn applause but keeps a family from falling apart. While Lydia hosted lavish dinners and charity galas, I was climbing under sinks and balancing budgets. I remember one cold winter afternoon, standing on the icy driveway with a wrench in hand, fixing a broken pipe that had flooded the basement. My fingers were numb and raw, but I didn't complain. I was doing what needed to be done. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And silently, I hoped my efforts might one day soften the harsh judgments that followed me like shadows. More than once, I extended a hand to Lydia when she found herself in financial trouble. Without hesitation, I lent her money, emergency loans, always without interest. Because despite her ease with money and charm, she was often reckless, caught up in the whirl of social obligations and impulsive spending. I never mentioned these loans. I didn't want recognition or thanks. It was just a quiet act of sisterly support, even if it was rarely acknowledged. I absorbed these burdens with a quiet stoicism, convincing myself that family was ultimately about support, even if it was one-sided. My sacrifices extended beyond money. When Father's health declined, I set aside my own career ambitions to care for him. There were missed promotions and opportunities that slipped through my fingers because I was the one planning his doctor visits, managing medications, and balancing the household chaos. I watched as Lydia continued climbing social ladders, attended gala after gala, while I measured my days in hospital appointments and repair schedules. Ethan was patient and understanding, reminding me gently that my work mattered, that my sacrifices were not in vain. His steady presence was a balm against the isolation I sometimes felt. Through it all, I held on to a fragile hope that someday, perhaps, my contributions would be recognized, that the quiet backbone I provided would be seen not as servitude, but as strength. I told myself that family love might be complicated, but it was still love, and that my patience, my endurance, was a virtue that would eventually earn respect. But deep inside, the sting of invisibility never quite faded. Each unacknowledged repair, each whispered slight about my frugality chipped away at my resolve. Still, I continued, doing the unseen work, quietly funding education, quietly fixing homes, quietly supporting the family no one else seemed willing to hold together. This was the reality I lived, a life of sacrifice and silent strength, measured not in applause or accolades but in the slow accumulation of deeds done without fanfare. It was a world where my worth was never loudly proclaimed but deeply felt, a world where the true value of my efforts was understood only by those who, like me, knew what it meant to build something lasting from scratch. And yet, I wondered, how much longer could I carry this weight alone? How long before the balance tipped, before the quiet endurance turned into something else entirely? The answers were not clear then, only the certainty that my story was far from over. The room felt thick with the usual blend of forced smiles and simmering undercurrents as we gathered around the long mahogany table, the same one that had witnessed so many family dramas over the years. It was another Burgess family meeting, an event that masqueraded as a chance for connection, but was more often a stage for subtle power plays and veiled insults. As everyone settled into their seats, I tried to steady my breathing. I knew what was coming. I always did. Lydia's eyes flicked toward me with that knowing gleam, the one that said she was about to make a scene. And sure enough, as the conversation meandered from trivial family gossip to updates on careers and finances, Lydia seized her moment. She leaned back, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth, her voice loud enough to carry across the room. "Honor still drives that old thing? That car is practically junk. I mean, she can't even buy a car that fits the family name." The laughter that followed wasn't spontaneous. It was calculated, a chorus of polite chuckles and subtle nods from relatives eager to side with the golden child. I forced my lips into a tight smile, swallowing the sharp knot in my throat. The old thing was a sensible sedan, nothing flashy, but reliable, and bought with money I earned. I'd never cared much for flashy displays. To me, practicality was a virtue. But in this room, my practicality was reduced to a punchline. Margaret, my mother, added her voice like a low undertone of dismissal. She sniffed, wrinkling her nose just so, and said, "It's just junk. Really, Honor, you should consider something more impressive." Her tone wasn't cruel, not overtly, but it carried the unmistakable weight of disappointment, a slight that echoed louder than words. I could feel every eye in the room flicker between us, some with thinly veiled amusement, others with a touch of awkwardness as they sensed the tension beneath the surface. The room's atmosphere thickened, pressing down on me like a weight I'd carried for years. As the conversation moved on, Lydia continued her subtle jabs, weaving stories about her latest social engagements and charitable endeavors. The contrast between her glamorous world and mine was hammered home with each word. My aerospace projects, the late nights drafting and testing, the satisfaction of solving complex problems, they were invisible here, replaced by quips about thriftiness and lack of style. I felt a familiar sting, a mix of humiliation and invisibility. I wanted to speak up, to remind them of the work I do, the dedication I pour into my career, the sacrifices I've made. But the words stuck in my throat. What was the point? In this family room, my accomplishments were irrelevant, drowned out by the performative glitz of parties and appearances. Still, I maintained my composure. A smile curved my lips, calm on the outside even as my heart ached. I rationalized Lydia's cruelty as jealousy, my mother's coldness as blindness to a different kind of success. I told myself this was just how it always was, that family love was complicated and layered with unspoken hierarchies. Yet, as the meeting ended and the relatives began to drift away, laughter and chatter masking their judgments, the seed of discomfort took root deep inside me. The words echoed, "Junk, can't even buy a car," and I replayed them over and over. It was a reminder that in the eyes of my family, I was less than enough. Walking to my car later that day, the chilly air felt biting against my skin, but it wasn't the cold that made me shiver. It was the weight of being the daughter who never quite fit, the one whose quiet achievements were trivialized, whose worth was measured not by what she'd built, but by what she lacked in their eyes. Yet beneath that sting, a small spark flickered, a quiet defiance taking root. I may have been the overlooked one, the one dismissed as practical or too modest, but I was not invisible. I was more than the sum of their dismissive remarks. And somewhere, deep down, I knew this moment was not the end of the story, but a challenge, one I was no longer willing to accept quietly. The meeting had ended, but for me, the real reckoning was just beginning. The house was quiet that evening when I decided to step into the living room to grab a book I'd left on the side table. The rest of the family had long since said their goodbyes after the latest gathering, a meeting that left a bitter taste I was still trying to swallow. I wasn't expecting to overhear anything, but as I passed the slightly ajar door to the study, the one my mother used as her sanctuary, I caught voices, low, urgent, and unmistakably familiar. Curiosity, mixed with a flicker of unease, pulled me closer. I froze just outside the doorway, my breath held tight as Lydia's sharp tone pierced the hush. "She can't be trusted with the family's future," Lydia whispered fiercely. "Mom, if we let Honor anywhere near the inheritance meeting, she'll just complicate things. You know how she is, practical to a fault, but reckless with money when it comes to real opportunities." My mother's voice followed, colder than I expected. "I agree, Lydia. Honor's always been too cautious, too focused on her own little world. This isn't about fairness anymore. It's about preserving what Dad built. I don't want the estate to be tangled up in her hands." I felt a tightening in my chest, a slow burn turning into a white-hot flare. Their words cut deeper than any insult at the dinner table. This wasn't the usual belittlement. This was a calculated exclusion, a deliberate strategy to erase me from the family's future. Lydia continued, her voice dropping even lower but heavy with conviction. "Honestly, it's better if everything goes to me. At least I'll keep it in the family's name, run it properly. Honor's too wrapped up in her career, her aerospace projects. She's always been the black sheep, you know that. She lives modestly, sure, but that's because she mismanages what she has. Remember when she almost lost that townhouse? It's not just about appearances, it's about trust." A flush of anger rose, burning behind my eyes. The townhouse I'd painstakingly paid for with Ethan's and my combined savings. The late-night scrimping to cover mortgage payments without a single handout from Lydia or Mom. They were twisting facts to fit their narrative. I was the reliable one, the steady one, the one who kept the family grounded. Yet here they were, painting me as irresponsible. Then, the unspoken plan took shape in their words. "We should make sure the upcoming meeting excludes her entirely," Margaret said firmly. If it's just Lydia and me, we can finalize the estate without interference. Honor won't even know what hit her until it's done." Lydia laughed softly, a sound that felt like ice sliding across glass. "I'll handle the paperwork, and I'm already speaking with the lawyer about revising the will. Dad's trust fund can be redirected. It'll be seamless. Honor won't stand a chance." My hands clenched into fists at my sides. I wanted to storm in, to shout that this was betrayal, not just against me, but against the memory of my father's principles. But instead, I stood silent, absorbing the full weight of their conspiracy. Then came the worst part. The whispers I'd heard before, but never confirmed, now declared openly. "Did you hear about the rumors I've been planting?" Lydia said with a venomous edge. "That Honor's lifestyle is proof she's financially irresponsible? That she's fast running out of money because she can't manage her affairs? It's all about discrediting her before she even gets a say." Margaret chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "It's true. Nobody wants to believe she's struggling. So we have to make sure the family sees the real Honor, the one who can't keep up. It's just necessary." I swallowed the rising bile in my throat. The web of deceit was not just about money or assets. It was about destroying my reputation, isolating me completely. I could see it clearly now. They had been laying this groundwork for months, tightening the noose with every casual slight, every junk comment, every dismissive glance. At that moment, Ethan appeared behind me quietly, his eyes searching mine. He'd been following my journey, witnessing the cracks in the family facade, but hearing this confirmed his quiet fears. His hand found mine, a silent gesture of solidarity, reminding me I wasn't truly alone. I stepped away from the door, my mind racing, the last thread of hope I'd clung to, that family fairness might still prevail, snapped. There would be no equal footing at the table, no shared legacy, just exclusion and erasure. But beneath the shock, beneath the hurt, a new resolve began to crystallize. This was a betrayal I could not ignore. Not now, not ever. They had made their choice, and I would make mine. Whatever came next, I knew I couldn't stay passive in the shadows any longer. The quiet endurance that had defined me until now was about to give way to deliberate action. I owed it to myself, and to the memory of my father, to demand respect, recognition, and justice. The war for the Burgess legacy was no longer just about money or status. It was about reclaiming my place in a family that had tried to forget me, and showing them, once and for all, that I was not to be dismissed so easily. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the heater struggling against the chill of the evening. I sank into the worn armchair by the window, the one that faced the fading light of the day, and let the quiet seep into my bones. The day's events, the cruel remarks, the whispered conspiracies, played on a loop inside my mind, each word like a fresh sting. For so many years, I had carried this weight, a heavy, invisible burden of being underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed. But tonight felt different. Tonight, grief was morphing into something far more combustible: anger. I closed my eyes and let the memories wash over me. I saw myself as a little girl, clutching that intricately crafted satellite model, eyes shining with hope, only to have my mother's cool dismissal blur the edges of my dreams. I remembered the endless chain of family dinners where Lydia's laughter filled the room, and mine was swallowed by silence. I heard every snide comment, every subtle jab disguised as casual conversation. "Too practical," they said. "Not quite fitting in." Words like poison, slowly seeping into the fabric of my self-worth. And yet, I had endured. I had endured the favoritism that elevated Lydia and buried me. I had endured the invisible labor of fixing broken pipes, managing bills, and quietly bailing out my sister's reckless spending, all while my own dreams and ambitions were minimized or ignored. I remembered the nights Ethan and I huddled over our finances, scraping together every last penny to keep our modest home afloat. Home that was mocked as less than by the very people who should have been proud. The deeper I delved into these memories, the more the grief hardened into a simmering rage. How many times had I swallowed my pride to keep the peace? How many times had I let their words slide because I wanted to believe family meant unconditional love? But love didn't look like this. It looked like judgment, exclusion, and betrayal. And I realized I was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally drained from pretending that their approval was a prize I could still win. My mind sharpened with clarity. I was not a charity case to be pitied or a backup plan to be sidelined. I was not the family's scapegoat, the awkward daughter who could be laughed at behind her back. No longer would I accept the role I had been assigned, background noise to Lydia's spotlight. I thought of every loan I'd quietly extended to Lydia, every repair I'd made to the family home, every sacrifice I'd silently endured. Those acts were not signs of weakness but of strength, and they deserved something better than to be met with contempt or suspicion. The fact that they plotted to exclude me from the inheritance meeting, that they whispered lies about my financial responsibility, struck at the very core of my identity. A cold resolve settled in my chest. They would never see me as I truly was, not because I lacked value, but because their eyes were clouded by jealousy and fear. They thrived on the illusion that Lydia was the prize, the worthy heir to the Burgess legacy. But legacies built on exclusion and deceit were brittle, and I was done playing my part in their fragile facade. I pictured the long family table where so many judgments had been cast. No longer would I be the silent victim at that table. I would stand up, not with tears or pleas, but with force and dignity. I owed it to myself to reclaim the narrative, to stop hoping for validation from a family that refused to see me. The anger was not reckless. It was measured, strategic, a fire that burned away the fog of doubt and replaced it with fierce determination. I would no longer let their whispers define my worth. I would build my own future, on my own terms, and make them reckon with the truth of who I really was. As the night deepened, I felt the first stirrings of a plan taking shape in my mind. This was no longer about silent endurance. It was about purposeful action, about drawing a line and saying, enough. The years of invisibility and exploitation had forged a strength they could not ignore. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight inside me lifting, not because the pain was gone, but because I was ready to transform it into power. The road ahead would not be easy. The family would resist, would mock, would try to pull me back into the shadows. But I was done shrinking, done waiting for a place at a table where I was never truly welcome. I breathed deeply, letting the calm steadiness return to my racing heart. Tomorrow and all the days after would be different. Because tonight, in the solitude of my quiet home, I awoke, not as the overlooked daughter, but as a woman prepared to reclaim her dignity, her voice, and her rightful place in the story of the Burgess family. The reckoning was only just beginning. The moment I resolved that I would no longer be the family's invisible caretaker, I knew I had to be strategic. This wasn't about screaming or confrontation. It was about quiet, calculated moves that would shift the power dynamic without giving them any inkling of what was coming. I started by mapping out the true dependencies within the Burgess family, because beneath the surface of their confident facades, there were cracks, and I intended to exploit them with precision. Lydia, for all her charm and social grace, was like a delicate chandelier held together by strings of financial favors and social validation. Her entire persona was built on appearances, but behind the polished veneer was a woman who relied heavily on bailouts. I remembered the times I'd lent her emergency funds without interest, covering shortfalls no one else was willing to acknowledge. Those loans were never repaid on time, not because she was malicious, but because Lydia floated from one social event to another, distracted by status and image, never learning to handle money responsibly. Her expensive tastes, the designer clothes, the high-profile charity galas, all of it depended on a quiet network of support, much of which I had been providing without recognition. Margaret, on the other hand, was a different kind of dependent. My mother's pride in Lydia blinded her to the cracks in her own self-sufficiency. She leaned heavily on me, not just for the practical tasks like fixing the leaky pipes and managing the household bills, but emotionally as well. I was the one who answered her calls when Lydia was too busy, the one who arranged doctor appointments, who sorted through insurance paperwork, and who quietly handled the family's chaos behind the scenes. She depended on my steadiness to keep her world from unraveling, yet she refused to acknowledge the cost I bore. This quiet reliance was a secret thread tying me to the family's daily survival, even as they dismissed me. With these realizations, I began to draw up a plan. I reached out to a lawyer I trusted, someone who understood the nuances of family dynamics and estate law. I wanted to make sure my own will and financial arrangements reflected the truth I had uncovered, that Lydia and Margaret were not the rightful sole heirs to Dad's legacy. I instructed the lawyer to revise my documents, removing both Lydia and Mom from any future claims to my assets. It was a necessary, painful step, but I could no longer allow the same cycle of entitlement and exclusion to continue unchecked. Simultaneously, I started shoring up my financial security. Over the years, I had invested quietly, small personal stocks, retirement funds, and even a few shares in aerospace startups. These assets were mine alone, built from sweat, sleepless nights, and more than a few sacrifices. I arranged for upgrades, updated my car, secured access to a private helicopter service, and began preparing for a moment when I would need to make a statement that couldn't be ignored. While all this was unfolding behind the scenes, I maintained a composed facade in daily communications. Calls with Lydia remained polite, yet distant. I responded to Mom's requests for help, but with measured boundaries. No alarms were raised, no suspicions stirred. The family mistook my quiet professionalism for acceptance, completely unaware that I was orchestrating a fundamental shift beneath their noses. I also took care to document everything. Every conversation, every request, every slight and loan was noted meticulously. I knew that if the battle escalated, I would need evidence, not just for legal reasons, but as a record of the truth long ignored by those who claimed to know me best. This phase of strategic planning was the most delicate. It demanded patience, restraint, and an unwavering focus on the endgame. I couldn't allow my emotions to leak into my actions. The family thrived on drama and would use any hint of weakness against me. So I kept my plans close to my chest, only confiding in Ethan, whose quiet support was invaluable. He understood that this wasn't just about money or status. It was about reclaiming my dignity and establishing boundaries that had been absent for far too long. Together, we rehearsed how I would handle the family meeting that was fast approaching, knowing that this would be my moment to quietly flip the script. They might still see me as the practical daughter, the awkward one who couldn't fit in, but I was preparing to show them something they hadn't expected, that I was no longer willing to play by their rules. The family's reliance on me was deeper than they acknowledged, and now, I was ready to turn that dependence into my power. The storm was gathering, but from the outside, nothing had changed. The family remained blissfully unaware of the calculated moves I was making, the silent recalibration that would soon rewrite our story. My patience had a purpose, and my quiet strength was gathering momentum. What came next would be a reckoning they never saw coming. I knew that stepping back wouldn't be easy. It was not just about withdrawing support. It was about dismantling the invisible safety net I had built under Lydia and Mom for years without thanks. These were the moments when my strength would be tested, when their dependency, so carefully hidden behind a veil of entitlement, would be forced into the light. But I was ready. I had to be. The first move was to decline Lydia's latest loan request, a modest sum compared to the bailouts I'd quietly provided before, but a clear message. When she called, her usual cheerful tone carried an edge of desperation. "Honor, I'm in a bit of a pinch. Can you help me out again? Just this once. You know how tight things are with the gala season coming up." I paused, heart tightening. The sister I once wanted to shield felt more like a stranger now, one who had taken so much without acknowledgement. "Lydia," I said carefully, "I'm not able to help this time. We have our own expenses to manage." Silence crackled on the other end. "Look, I've always been there for you. This is different. You need to find another way." I ended the call gently but firmly. I could almost hear the hesitation in her breath, the shock of being refused. It was a small victory, but an essential one. No more invisible rescues. Next came the conscious decision to stop volunteering for the family errands that had become expected of me. Dropping off checks, coordinating repairs, running last-minute errands. These tasks had become my silent labor, unnoticed and unappreciated. When Mom called asking if I could pick up supplies for the garden party Lydia was hosting, I hesitated, then said no. "I'm sorry, Mom. My schedule is full this week." It wasn't a lie, but it was a boundary. The familiar pleading in her voice stirred something cold inside me, a mix of guilt and relief. Meanwhile, I took stock of the shared financial accounts we had, some for household expenses, some for the family home repairs I managed for years. It was time to assert control. I contacted our bank and froze access to several joint accounts that Lydia had been using without consulting me. I changed passwords linked to shared properties, ensuring that I was the sole gatekeeper moving forward. Legal advice had warned me to be meticulous. I couldn't afford any oversight that would give them leverage. Each transaction I reversed or froze felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. For years, I had been the family's invisible accountant, repaying debts, covering oversights, and patching financial holes. Now I was the one setting the terms. Throughout this process, I maintained a calm exterior. At the next family meeting, I answered questions with polite brevity. I didn't mention the frozen accounts or declined loans. The family seemed oblivious, or perhaps in denial. Lydia's sharp comments continued, but I greeted them with a measured coolness that unsettled her. I was no longer the easy target. Behind the scenes, I arranged for something far more symbolic, a private helicopter service. The thought of calling for a helicopter to pick me up after the family meeting was intoxicating, a quiet, unspoken assertion of independence and success that no one could mock or diminish. It was a stark contrast to the cheap jabs about my car and junk possessions. Booking the helicopter was more than indulgence. It was a statement. It said, without words, "I have the means. I have the power. I am not who you think I am." Throughout these weeks, Ethan was my confidant and strategist. He helped me coordinate timing, reminded me to keep my emotions in check during meetings, and quietly took care of logistics. His support was the steady force that kept me grounded when the weight of impending confrontation pressed down. I noticed subtle shifts in family dynamics as I pulled back. Lydia's calls grew increasingly frequent but more curt, peppered with veiled threats and pleas. Mother's messages changed tone, from dismissive to pleading, as if sensing the loss of control. Yet none dared ask directly about the changes I was making. They were watching, waiting for a sign of weakness, but there was none to give. Within this quiet withdrawal, I was rewriting my story. The family who had long taken my support for granted was now faced with absence. Not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. The foundation they had leaned on was shifting beneath their feet. I wasn't just stepping away, I was stepping up, asserting control over what was mine. The family's underestimation of me had been their greatest weakness. And now, as the rotors of the helicopter quietly hummed into readiness weeks in advance, I prepared to transform that underestimated strength into a moment they could never ignore. This phase was delicate, each move calculated to unsettle without provocation, to reveal power without confrontation. The family thought I was still the practical, awkward daughter, quietly enduring. But beneath that calm surface, I was building a quiet storm. The stage was set, the pieces in motion. And soon, the family meeting wouldn't just be about old grudges or whispered judgments. It would be the moment when everything changed. The day of the next family meeting arrived with a strange mix of anticipation and calm that only I could feel. The others carried on as usual. Lydia with her practiced charm, Mom with her sharp eyes that never quite missed a detail, the rest of the relatives chattering about trivial things, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface. The long mahogany table stood polished and imposing in the center of the room, ready once again to host the unspoken battle over respect, recognition, and legacy. As we all took our seats, Lydia's eyes locked onto me with a familiar flash, one that always foretold a barb waiting to be thrown. The room hummed with polite small talk, but I sensed the undercurrent of judgment ebbing beneath the surface, as it always did when I was present, but never truly seen. Then, as if scripted to perfection, Lydia's voice cut through the noise, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Honor still drives that old thing, doesn't she? Honestly, she can't even buy a car that fits the family name." Her words were sharp, dripping with disdain. A few relatives snorted or exchanged glances, smirks twitching at the corners of their mouths, as if waiting for my reaction. I met her gaze steadily, my lips curving into a calm, composed smile that hid the storm burning quietly inside. The car she mocked was a sensible sedan, practical, reliable, purchased with money I earned through years of hard work and late nights. It wasn't flashy, and it wasn't meant to be. But in this room, practicality was a punchline. Margaret, my mother, added her voice, quiet but laced with that same dismissive tone that had haunted me for years. It's just junk, Honor. Maybe it's time for something more impressive. Her words, soft as they were, landed like icy daggers. The room shifted, the air thickening with the collective judgment only family can wield. The laughter that followed was unmistakably forced, a chorus of polite chuckles that barely masked the cruelty beneath. I could feel the familiar sting, years of belittlement and dismissal condensed into a single moment. But this time, something was different. The pain was there, yes, but alongside it bloomed a sharp clarity and resolve. I didn't flinch. I didn't shrink. Instead, I reached calmly into my purse, feeling the smooth edges of my phone, the cool touch grounding me. I dialed the number I'd memorized weeks ago, the one that represented far more than a mere ride home. "Come pick me up now," I said, my voice steady, controlled, resonant with quiet authority. A hush fell over the room, the chatter fading into stunned silence as the seconds ticked by. Outside, through the large bay window, the distant whirring of rotor blades began to rise, growing louder, more insistent. The sleek silhouette of a helicopter approached, its blades slicing through the air with confident power. Heads turned, eyes widening in disbelief as the rotors spun faster, the machine descending onto the manicured lawn just beyond the porch. The polished metal gleamed in the afternoon sun, a symbol of the success and independence they had so often denied me. Lydia's confident smirk faltered, her mouth opening and closing as if to protest, but no words came. The room held its breath, the weight of the moment pressing down hard. Then, as if overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fortune and the undeniable statement I was making, Lydia's legs buckled beneath her. She fainted, collapsing into the arms of a startled aunt. I stayed seated, unmoved by the spectacle I'd just set in motion. There was no triumph in gloating, only an unshakable calm that surprised even me. I had waited years for this moment, not for revenge, but for recognition. Not to break them, but to break free. As I stood and gathered my things, the room remained silent, the energy crackling with a mixture of shock, shame, and something else, perhaps a grudging respect, or simply disbelief. My footsteps were sure and steady as I walked toward the door, the sound of the helicopter's rotors growing louder, welcoming me to a new chapter defined by my own terms. They had mocked my car as junk, dismissed my achievements as insignificant, and tried to erase me from the family legacy. But now, as I stepped into that helicopter, I was no longer just Honor Burgess, the overlooked daughter. I was Honor Burgess, the woman who built her own wings and soared beyond their narrow definitions. The rotors sliced through the afternoon air, carrying me away from the long table of whispered judgments and forced smiles. And though the family remained behind, stunned and silent, I felt a profound sense of liberation ripple through me. This was not an end, but a beginning. A moment that demanded their attention and forced them to reckon with the truth they had ignored for so long. And as the helicopter lifted off, spinning toward the horizon, I knew that the story was far from over. Because sometimes, the most powerful statements are made not in words, but in the unmistakable sound of rotors cutting through the sky. The silence that followed my helicopter's arrival in the family room was a thick, suffocating thing. It wasn't the polite hush that often comes after a sharp remark or awkward comment. No, this was different. This was the stunned silence of a family forced to swallow a truth they desperately wanted to deny. The smooth hum of the rotors outside filled the space where words once bounced off the walls like barbs. Faces froze mid-expression, smiles faltered, sick grins vanished, and eyes widened with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Lydia's collapse wasn't just physical. It was a symbolic unraveling of the carefully constructed facade she had maintained for so long. The golden child, the socialite who thrived on approval and appearances, was suddenly exposed as someone who had relied too heavily on the very family she sought to dominate. Her faint left the room breathless, the air charged with a tension that no one dared break. As she was gently eased onto the sofa by our aunt, the others began to stir, their eyes darting between Lydia and me, a quiet, unyielding presence. I sat back down, my face calm, my hands folded neatly in my lap, masking the fierce satisfaction simmering beneath. I was no longer the subject of whispered jokes or scornful laughter. I had shifted the power dynamic with a quiet confidence they had never anticipated. It didn't take long for the phone calls and messages to flood in. Lydia, once so sure of her place, was now scrambling to salvage her reputation and her standing, not just within the family, but in the eyes of friends and the wider social circles she so desperately clung to. Her voice messages were tinged with desperation, a tone that was foreign to the poised, charismatic woman everyone knew. "Honor, please, we need to talk," she pleaded in one. "This isn't like you. I know you're upset, but you have to understand why we did what we did." I listened silently, my finger hovering over the delete button. The words felt hollow, lacking the sincerity or accountability I now demanded. Lydia's casual cruelty had always been calculated, and now, when the tables turned, her pleas sounded like the last gasps of a sinking ship. Margaret's approach was subtler, but no less potent. Letters arrived, each one layered with guilt and thinly veiled blame. "Dear Honor," one began, "I never meant for things to come to this. Lydia's fall was more than I could bear, and I worry about what this is doing to our family. Perhaps if you could find it in your heart to forgive." The words dripped with sorrow, but also with an unmistakable undercurrent of insistence that I shoulder the blame for the fracture. I didn't respond. There was no forgiveness to be granted here, only recognition that their actions had consequences, and that my silence was no longer an option. Meanwhile, Ethan kept me grounded. Through quiet conversations in the evenings, he shared the glimpse of the family's unraveling from his perspective, the frantic calls Lydia made, the heated exchanges between Margaret and relatives who were beginning to question the Burgess family's image of unity and grace. "They're scared," he said one night, "not just of losing money, but of losing control. They thought you were the quiet one, the one who would forever be overlooked. Now, you've changed the game." Friends and even distant relatives began to notice the shift. Whispers of Lydia's entitlement and the family's internal conflicts began to float beyond the walls of our gatherings. People who once admired Lydia's effortless charm started to question the narrative they'd been told. The carefully maintained image of a perfect family was cracking. Yet, through all the turmoil, I remained steady. I refused to engage in the frantic attempts at manipulation or the guilt trips that came their way. I had stepped into a space of quiet strength, where respect was earned through actions, not demanded through lineage or sentiment. This calm resilience was perhaps the most unsettling thing for the Burgess family. They were used to having their way, to bending others to their will with whispers, smirks, and subtle pressure. But now, the daughter they had underestimated was a force neither expected nor prepared for. The financial consequences hit swiftly. Bills that had once been quietly managed began piling up unnoticed. Repairs on the family home stalled as the invisible labor that had supported it stopped flowing. Invitations to elite social events were rescinded or quietly withdrawn, as Lydia's social standing diminished. Even Margaret's health began to suffer under the weight of stress and fractured family ties, forcing her to seek outside help, something she had always resisted while I was around. The family's attempts to regain control ranged from overt threats veiled as concern to emotional appeals meant to fracture my resolve. But I was prepared. Every interaction was carefully documented. Calls, messages, letters, moments where loyalty was tested or boundaries challenged. This record was more than a shield. It was a testament to the truth they tried to erase. Some relatives reached out quietly, their voices tinged with regret, acknowledging the cracks that had long been ignored. But those late apologies could not undo years of neglect, favoritism, and betrayal. The trust, once broken, was not easily mended. And as the family grappled with the fallout of their choices, I found a new peace in the distance I created. The humiliation they once inflicted had given way to a respect born from undeniable strength. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was mine now, defined by boundaries I set and dignity reclaimed. The family meeting that had once been a stage for my humiliation had become the catalyst for transformation, and while the Burgess family struggled to regain footing, I was already stepping into a future where my worth was no longer tied to their approval. The aftermath of my helicopter departure rippled through the Burgess household, like a sudden storm breaking a long-held illusion. The carefully maintained facade of control and affluence began to crack, exposing vulnerabilities no one was prepared to face. Bills that had once been quietly managed, thanks to my oversight, started to pile up unchecked. The family home, a sprawling estate that had been my silent responsibility, felt the impact immediately. Renovations that were supposed to breathe new life into aging walls ground to a halt. Contractors called repeatedly, their voices tinged with confusion and frustration, as payments faltered and schedules slipped. What had once been a smoothly run operation now resembled a house on the brink of neglect. Lydia's social calendar, once packed with glamorous events and elite dinners, began to suffer as word of our family's internal conflicts spread. Invitations that once arrived like golden tickets stopped coming altogether. The glossy magazines and society pages she had counted on to bolster her image no longer featured her as prominently. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, her circle of friends and admirers began to shrink. People started to whisper, questioning the stability and reputation that Lydia had so carefully curated. The veneer of effortless charm that had concealed a precarious reliance on family resources was peeling away, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Margaret, my mother, who had long wielded her pride like armor, was not immune to the fallout. The strain of fractured family ties and mounting stress took a visible toll on her health. I saw it in the way her hands trembled slightly when she reached for her teacup, in the weariness that settled deep in her eyes. The woman who had once dismissed my steadiness now found herself unable to maintain the equilibrium I had quietly sustained for years. She reluctantly accepted the help of outside caregivers and professionals, something she had always resisted, clinging fiercely to the illusion that our family could handle everything internally. This new reality unsettled her profoundly, and with each reluctant appointment or medical visit she attended, the distance between us widened even more. Attempts by Lydia and Margaret to regain control over the crumbling situation grew desperate. Lydia's calls to me were laden with veiled threats disguised as concern, her voice sometimes cracking under the pressure of losing her grip. "Honor, you don't understand what you're doing," she warned once. "This isn't just about money. It's about family. You'll regret this." I listened without reply, knowing her words were more about fear than reason. Margaret's messages came cloaked in sorrowful guilt, often blaming Lydia's collapse on my pride and unwillingness to forgive. Yet beneath the sorrow was a barely concealed insistence that I should relent, that I should return to the role of dutiful daughter and caretaker. I stood firm. Every interaction, from the passive-aggressive emails to the late-night calls filled with pleas and accusations, I documented meticulously. This wasn't just about protecting myself legally. It was about preserving the truth in a family narrative that had long been rewritten to exclude me. Each recorded conversation was a thread in a tapestry revealing the real dynamics at play: favoritism, manipulation, betrayal. Among extended family and friends, whispers of Lydia's entitlement and the Burgess family's internal strife began to spread. The social circles she had relied on for validation started questioning her character, peeling back layers of charm to reveal the fault lines underneath. Invitations were rescinded quietly, not with fanfare but with abrupt silences and cold shoulders. Lydia found herself increasingly isolated, a queen dethroned not by scandal, but by the slow unraveling of the support system she had once taken for granted. Meanwhile, some relatives reached out to me quietly, their voices low and hesitant, tinged with regret. They acknowledged the fractures that had long been ignored, the cracks in the family's polished image that I had been pointing to for years. Yet their apologies, offered belatedly and without fanfare, could not undo the years of neglect and exclusion. Trust, once broken, requires more than words to mend, and I was no longer certain it was worth the effort. The consequences of my withdrawal were clear and swift. A family once propped up by my silent labor now faced the difficult choice of reckoning with reality or continuing to spiral. The social invitations rescinded, the stalled renovations, the growing financial strain. They were all signs that the Burgess legacy was far from invincible. Through it all, I found a quiet peace in the distance I had created. The humiliations of the past, once so raw and painful, had transformed into a foundation for strength and dignity. My worth was no longer tethered to their approval or the illusion of family perfection. The path ahead was uncertain, yes, but it was mine to navigate, defined by boundaries I had set and the respect I now demanded. The family meeting that had once been a stage for my humiliation had become the catalyst for transformation. And while the Burgess family struggled to regain footing, I was already stepping into a future where my worth was no longer measured by their judgments, but by my own unshakable confidence. The moment I stepped away from the helicopter, leaving behind the stunned faces and the fainting spell, I knew the family dynamics had shifted irreversibly. But this shift was only the beginning, not the resolution. They had to understand that respect, equality, and accountability were no longer optional when it came to me. I wasn't just claiming a moment of triumph. I was setting new terms for every interaction that would follow. In the quiet aftermath, I began to define these boundaries clearly in my mind and in practice. Respect would be the baseline. No more dismissive remarks. No more cutting jabs about my lifestyle or accomplishments. Equality meant my voice counted just as much as anyone else's at that table. Accountability required them to acknowledge past wrongs and to engage with me honestly, not through whispers, manipulation, or exclusion. I made a conscious decision that if these conditions could not be met, I would not allow their toxicity to infiltrate my life. The old, familiar pattern of hurt and disappointment had to end. I would choose peace over pain, dignity over denial, and strength over submission. This was the first time I wasn't just reacting. I was leading the narrative, steering the future of how my family and I related. Ethan played a crucial role in this transformation. He was more than a husband. He was my anchor and my sounding board. Together, we discussed the emotional and practical implications of enforcing these boundaries. There were no illusions about the challenges ahead. We knew the family would resist. They'd attempt to guilt trip us or gaslight the situation. But we were prepared. Our home became a sanctuary, a space where I could heal and regroup, surrounded by unconditional support. I also began cultivating what I call my chosen family, those friends and colleagues who saw me for who I truly was, who celebrated my successes rather than diminished them. These relationships filled spaces long left hollow by the Burgess family's neglect. Their encouragement reminded me daily that worth isn't given by birthright. It's earned by authenticity and integrity. This new circle became a place where vulnerability was met with empathy, not judgment, where achievements were applauded, not dismissed. I found strength in community, a reminder that family isn't always defined by DNA. It's about connection, respect, and shared values. Meanwhile, the Burgess household was dealing with the consequences of their choices. Financial chaos rippled through the estate. The unpaid bills, the stalled renovations, the fraying social ties. Lydia's social standing weakened as invitations dissipated, and whispers of entitlement followed her like a shadow. Margaret's health declined, burdened by stress and the loss of the support system she'd taken for granted. Despite their attempts to regain control, through pleas, threats, and emotional manipulation, I stood firm. I documented every interaction carefully. This record wasn't just legal protection. It was a testament to my experience and to the truth that had long been ignored. It was a way to hold the family accountable, even if they refused to hold themselves accountable first. Some distant relatives reached out privately, their voices tinged with regret or curiosity. But I kept my distance. The wounds ran too deep, and while forgiveness is a gift I might choose to give someday, it would never come at the cost of my self-respect or boundaries. In this space of new boundaries and healed distance, I found a profound sense of peace. I was no longer tethered to the Burgess family's definition of worth, my achievements, my quiet strength, my integrity, they were mine and mine alone to cherish. And I could build a future that honored those truths without waiting for permission or recognition. This journey has taught me that family can sometimes be a place of pain and exclusion, but it can also be a place of chosen love and respect. I choose the latter, and as I face forward, I do so with the quiet confidence of a woman who has reclaimed her story, her dignity, and her wings. The road ahead remains uncertain. There will be challenges, negotiations, and perhaps new confrontations, but I walk it with firm steps. The helicopter that lifted me away was more than a vehicle. It was a symbol of freedom, resilience, and rebirth. And now, grounded in my truth, I am ready to soar.